Distinguished President, Excellencies, colleagues and friends, a few days ago we celebrated the centenary year of Nelson Mandela's birth. We spoke of his example, his fortitude, his suffering and compassion, while recalling also the declaration that he and my predecessor, Mary Robinson, signed in 2000 on diversity and tolerance. And it was right for us not just to have remembered Mandela's greatness, but to have almost unconsciously contrasted it with all the narrow politicians who continue to proliferate across the face of the world. Authoritarian in nature, many of them are wily political infighters, but most are of thin mind and faint humanity, prone to fan division and intolerance, and just for the sake of securing their political ambition. While some do this more openly than others, all are well aware what they practice comes at the expense of vulnerable humans. To them, I say, you may seize power or stubbornly hold on to it by playing on and stoking the fears of your followers. You may congratulate yourself for this, and you may think yourself so clever for it, but we know all you've done is copy the behavior of previous generations of once strong but ultimately catastrophic leaders and politicians. Yours, in the end, will become a mouse-like global reputation, never the fine example of the leader you think you are, and never even close to a Mandela. To deserve global respect, you must begin to follow his example, committing to the spirit and letter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What makes it so difficult for us to understand this declaration, its universality, and how to view our fundamental sameness relative to our differences? We are all humans. We are almost identical genetically. On average, in DNA sequence, each human is 99.9% the same as any other human. We have the same organs. We all have to breathe, eat, sleep, and to survive as a species, reproduce. We have feelings, we love, we think, we have hopes, and if fortunate, we will grow old before expiring. This is the core of what it is to be a human being. Everything that's bolted on, that is color, race, ethnicity, gender, and all the rest, comes only after the acquisition by each of us of our rights as human beings. And this is what the adoption of the Universal Declaration formalized 70 years ago. The present-day hatred and its corresponding rising uncertainties seems to come from humans who view the relationship between the core and the bolted-on characteristics in reverse. In their view, the differences decide everything. But this approach, if each of us were to adopt it and act upon it, would be an open invitation to human self-annihilation. It cannot be. It simply cannot be. Mr. President, since my last update to this Council, I have conducted missions to Libya, Peru, Uruguay, El Salvador, Guatemala, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and Fiji. Recognizing that not all states will accept a visit, I express my deep appreciation for these invitations, which demonstrate commendable openness to discussing human rights issues. In my statement to the Council in June, I will be addressing the issue of refusals of access to international human rights mechanisms and to my office. As I did last year, I will read an abbreviated version of this statement, while the full and authoritative version will be uploaded to the office website, www.ohchr.org. In every instance, I encourage the concerned state to embark on deeper dialogue and cooperation with my office and the human rights mechanisms. Before I begin what will sadly prove to be a very long list of human rights violations and abuses, I would like to highlight a sample of advances which are underway in several countries. In Ecuador, I commend the government for conducting a very broad dialogue, including with media and human rights defenders, as a first step towards overcoming the country's polarization. In Saudi Arabia, I note with great interest the royal directive stipulating that all government services must from now on be provided to women without prior approval from male guardians. I commend the Gambia for its announcement of a moratorium on the death penalty last month. In Somalia, I welcome a number of positive developments, including the establishment of a National Human Rights Commission with a diverse composition, and I encourage the government to continue its efforts to build institutions and bring peace. Portugal has made noteworthy strides towards ending discrimination against Roma, sharply increasing the number of Roma aged 16 to 24 engaged in work, training, or education. Many people have suffered the violence of extremist and terrorist groups over the past few months, and I want to emphasize that I and my office condemn acts of terrorism wherever they occur unreservedly. There can be no justification of this blind violence which lashes out against ordinary people. I will now turn to the geographic sections of my statement, emphasizing the urgency of two situations. Syria, where the horror of Eastern Ghouta needs to be spoken of time and again, and Myanmar, where the most recent reports gathered by my office point to the continuation of ethnic cleansing in Rakhine State. Mr. President, as this Council session opened, the conflict in Syria entered a new phase of horror. In addition to the staggering bloodshed in Eastern Ghouta, which was discussed in urgent debate last week, escalating violence in the province of Idlib is placing some 2 million people in danger. In Afrin, the offensive by Turkey also threatening large numbers of civilians. People in government-controlled Damascus are also suffering a new escalation of ground-based strikes. And the offensive against extremist groups has also resulted in large-scale loss of civilian life. It must be recalled how the massive violations committed by the government of Syria and its local allies beginning in 2011 created the initial space in which extremist armed groups later flourished. Remember the Shabiha? Recent attempts to justify indiscriminate, brutal attacks on hundreds of thousands of civilians by the need to combat a few hundred fighters, as in Eastern Ghouta, are legally and morally unsustainable. Also, when you are prepared to kill your own people, lying is easy too. Claims by the government of Syria that it is taking every measure to protect its civilian population are frankly ridiculous. This month, it is Eastern Ghouta, which is, in the words of the Secretary General, hell on earth. Next month, or the month after, it will be somewhere else where people face an apocalypse intended, planned, and executed by individuals within the government, apparently with the full backing of some of their foreign supporters. It is urgent to reverse this catastrophic course and to refer Syria to the International Criminal Court. Mr. President, the conflict in Yemen continues to escalate, creating a humanitarian disaster of new magnitudes. Civilians suffer indiscriminate shelling and sniper attacks by Houthi and affiliated forces, as well as airstrikes conducted by the Saudi-led coalition forces. These remain the leading cause of civilian casualties, including child casualties in the conflict. I am particularly concerned about the hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped in the city of Taiz. The Council will receive a detailed update of my concerns on the 21st of March. Now, turning to Iran, I would like to recognize the loss of a giant and champion for human rights, Asma Jahangir, whose work has inspired many in the human rights community. On Iran, I deplore the odious practice of executing people for crimes committed when they were children. I am also concerned about the excessive use of force against demonstrations or demonstrators in December and January for economic and social rights, as well as the subsequent deaths of a number of protesters held in custody. Widespread resentment at high levels of youth unemployment, inequality, lack of accountability of state institutions, and the greater demand for rights should be addressed through dialogue and reforms. Repressive measures such as arrests and prosecutions of human rights defenders, journalists, international environmental activists, and women protesting against the compulsory hijab can only deepen the people's resentment. The Secretary General's report on Iran will be presented to the Council on the 21st of March. 6 reports will be presented to the Council regarding the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory under Item 7. Regarding the Council's request to my office to produce a database of business enterprises engaged in specific activities related to Israeli settlements, a total of 206 companies have been screened in out of 321 companies reviewed, and we expect to release further details after we have reviewed the detailed responses of all 206. In the coming days, my office will issue a report of what has been a significant expansion of illegal settlements over the past year, despite Security Council Resolution 2334. We will also release a report on the dramatic deterioration of the situation in Gaza, where complete economic and institutional collapse grows ever more likely. I am also concerned that human rights defenders have been detained by both Israeli and Palestinian authorities. Their movement is restricted and their funding is in jeopardy. Mr. President, the situation of the Rohingya community in Myanmar and of some 900,000 Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh continue to be of intense concern. As the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights announced this week, following his mission to Bangladesh, my office believes that ethnic cleansing is still underway in Rakhine State. While the township of Mangdao has been essentially emptied of its Rohingya community, people continue to flee to Bangladesh because of systematic, though lower intensity, persecution and violence in other towns and villages. Victims have reported killings, rape, torture, and abductions by the security forces and local militia, as well as apparently deliberate attempts to force the Rohingya to leave the area through starvation, with officials blocking their access to crops and food supplies. This Council is aware that my office has strong suspicions that acts of genocide may have taken place in Rakhine State since August. I am therefore not surprised by reports that Rohingya villages which were attacked in recent years, and alleged mass graves of the victims are being bulldozed. This appears to be a deliberate attempt by the authorities to destroy potential evidence of international crimes. I have also received reports of the appropriation of land inhabited by Rohingya and their replacement by members of other ethnic groups. The government must take steps towards real accountability for these violations and must fully respect the rights of the Rohingya, including to citizenship. While awaiting the final report of the fact-finding mission, I again recommend that this Council ask the General Assembly to establish a new independent and impartial mechanism to prepare and expedite criminal proceedings in courts against those responsible. Any repatriation agreement should lay out a clear pathway to citizenship and put an end to the discrimination and violence inflicted on the Rohingya. These conditions are clearly not in place today. I thank Bangladesh for hosting almost 1 million refugees, and I will continue to call on member states for long-term support for host communities, as well as to uphold the refugees' rights to education and a livelihood. In Cambodia, I am seriously concerned at increasing moves to repress dissent and close political and civil society space. Broadly worded legal provisions have been used to silence civil society organizations, journalists, and members and supporters of political parties. Since this Council last met, the Supreme Court has dissolved the principal opposition party, disenfranchising opposition voters. Recently adopted amendments to the Constitution and Criminal Code are likely to further erode political rights and fundamental freedoms. I note and welcome recent improvements in social protection and the minimum wage, but I call on the government to guarantee the political rights of the people, to respect the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, and to release human rights defenders and political actors. Given the scale and gravity of reported violations in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, I remain convinced that the situation should be referred to the International Criminal Court. Pursuant to this Council's Resolution 34/24, my office is moving forward with an accountability project to document human rights violations, particularly those which may amount to crimes against humanity. The Council will receive a briefing from my office in this regard on the 14th of March. Turning to China, President Xi has called for, and I quote, people-centered development for win-win outcomes as part of a community of shared future for mankind, end quote. A commendable ambition. Sadly, China's global ambitions on human rights are seemingly not mirrored by its record at home. My office continues to receive urgent appeals regarding arbitrary detentions and forced disappearances, ill treatment and discrimination emanating from human rights defenders, lawyers, legislators, booksellers, and members of communities such as Tibetans and Uyghurs. Many of these cases involve people struggling against economic, social, and cultural injustices, such as cases of corruption, illegal seizure of land and forced evictions, destruction of cultural sites, constraints on religious practices, and restrictions on the use of local languages. I look forward to resolving some of these issues with the Chinese government as we move towards China's UPR review in November. In the Philippines, I deplore President Duterte's statement last week to elite police units that they should not cooperate, and I quote, when it comes to human rights or whoever rapporteur it is, end quote, and the continued vilification of this Council's special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings by the authorities. The government has a duty to uphold human rights and to engage with persons appointed by this council. An increasingly authoritarian approach to governance threatens to irreparably damage 30 years of commendable efforts by the Philippines to strengthen the rule of law and respect for the human rights of the people. I note the International Criminal Court's announcement that it will open a preliminary inquiry or a preliminary examination. With respect to Kashmir, on both sides of the line of control, regrettably, unconditional access continues to be refused to my office, and I will report on this issue at greater length in June. In the Maldives, rather than comply with a Supreme Court ruling which ordered the release of 9 arbitrarily detained political leaders, including former President Nasheed, the government declared a state of emergency last month, suspending key rights as well as the entire criminal procedure code and opening the door to completely arbitrary decisions. The measure was followed by a wave of arrests, including of 80-year-old former President Gayoom, members of parliament, and the Chief Justice. While noting the government's acceptance of an immediate mission by my office, I'm deeply concerned that the rule of law, which is the foundation of any democratic state, is being undermined. Moreover, this crisis could have drastic effect on the lucrative tourist sector. I urge the complete reversal of these recent measures. In Sri Lanka, I am very alarmed by recurring and continuing episodes of mob violence targeting ethnic and religious minorities, particularly Muslims, including most recently in Ampara and in several locations in the Kandy district, leading to the declaration of a nationwide state of emergency for 10 days. There should be no impunity either for the incitement that led to the attacks or the attacks themselves. I have repeatedly urged the government to advance its implementation of the transitional justice agenda. I regret the absence of meaningful progress. It is urgent, for the sake of the victims, that progress be made on accountability and transitional justice. In the absence of such progress, I would encourage member states to explore the use of universal jurisdiction. The Council will be fully briefed on the 16th of March. Mr. President, in Sudan, I'm concerned that civilians in Darfur continue to suffer attacks by militias and state security forces, including the Rapid Support Force, in which many Janjaweed militia members have been integrated. I am deeply concerned about the plight of 2.5 million displaced people who face continuing violence by both security forces and militias. Since January, my office has received a new wave of reports of arrests and detentions of human rights defenders, political activists, and journalists across the country following demonstrations for economic and social rights. In Cameroon, what appears to be long-standing structural discrimination in the Anglophone region of the country has led to continuing clashes between security forces and separatist groups. The arrest in Nigeria of 47 Anglophone community leaders and their extradition to Cameroon has reportedly led to renewed violence in the southwest and northwest of the country. Allegations of summary executions of civilians by members of the security forces have been reported and are generating widespread resentment. I regret that my office has not been given access to verify these allegations. Acknowledging the complex challenges facing the authorities, including renewed displacement from the Central African Republic and the increase in Boko Haram attacks in the north, I urge the government to make every effort to de-escalate the conflict in the Anglophone regions and to allow unimpeded access to human rights monitors so that accurate information on the situation can inform constructive engagement on the way forward. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I deplore the continued repression of fundamental rights, as well as assaults on churches and religious sites by members of the youth wing of the ruling party. The government is not creating an environment conducive to free and credible elections. The Council will be fully briefed on the 20th of March, and my office will be releasing a detailed report in the coming days. I draw this Council's attention to the deteriorating human rights situation in Tanzania, including heavy-handed restrictions on media freedoms and on civil society, and an increasing number of attacks on and arrests of government critics. The government has also taken an increasingly repressive approach to important social issues, with arrests of LGBTI activists, growing attacks on the LGBTI community, and attacks and threats against people working to provide reproductive health care. The government's policy of permanently refusing any further education to girls who become pregnant is shocking, and I am disturbed by the High Court's finding that such a policy is not discriminatory. In Ethiopia, I welcome the release of more than 7,000 detainees in January and February, including several high-profile figures. I am concerned about the declaration of a second state of emergency last month. Reforms can only be carried out successfully through truly inclusive dialogue and political processes. I urge the authorities to investigate and prosecute those responsible for recent killings in the country, and I reiterate my request for access to affected regions. In Zimbabwe, I encourage the newly formed government to enact economic reforms to address inequalities and lay the foundations for truly sustainable and inclusive development based on human rights. It is also time to open civic and democratic space in the country, allowing all citizens to participate, associate, and express their opinions freely. In this connection, I am concerned about the recent amendments to the Constitution which rolled back gains on the independence of the judiciary, a real setback for reform. Mr. President, in Turkey, respect for fundamental rights continues to deteriorate. My office has received credible reports of arbitrary mass dismissals, arbitrary closure of civil society organizations, arbitrary detention of people arrested on broad allegations of links to terrorist organizations, torture in detention, restrictions on freedom of expression and freedom of movement, arbitrary expropriation of private property, and collective punishment targeting family members of individuals suspected of offenses. Given these deepening concerns, we will be releasing a detailed report in the coming days on the human rights situation in the context of the state of emergency, including an update on the situation in the southeast. Mr. President, over two-thirds of the national parliaments in European Union countries now include political parties with extreme positions against migrants, and in some cases, Muslims and other minority communities. This discourse, based on racism, xenophobia, and incitement to hatred, has now expanded so significantly that in several countries it is dominating the political landscape, as we saw during the election campaign in Italy in recent weeks. On migration policy, I am deeply concerned about the current overriding focus of EU states on preventing migrants from reaching Europe and rushing to deport many who do. The EU and its members need to review the approach they are taking in the Mediterranean to ensure that they are not indirectly supporting the return of migrants to Libya, where they face a real risk of torture, sexual offense, and other serious violations. I also call on the EU to adopt a human rights due diligence approach to their support to any Libyan authorities. In Austria, the new government, which includes an openly anti-migrant party, has announced it will embark on stringent surveillance, financial restrictions, or closure of associations, Muslim schools, and places of worship, broad criminalization of irregular migrants, with the stated intention to automatically expel them, and the adoption of extremely restrictive language on integration and citizenship. In Poland, over the past several years, reforms targeting the Constitutional Court and the judiciary have paved the way for partisan interpretation of the Constitution and domestic laws and severely weakened checks and balances. Other measures introduced by the government have compromised the right to freedom of assembly, politicized the office of the Prosecutor General, increased the powers of the secret services, and led to a significant strengthening of control by the executive branch over the judiciary, the media, civil society, and other spheres of public life. I am disturbed by widespread reports that the government frequently takes a passive approach to the growing number of hate crimes and incidents of hate speech against minority communities and migrants. In the Russian Federation, I am deeply concerned at what appears to be an orchestrated and coordinated campaign of violence and threats against members of a leading human rights group, Memorial Human Rights Center in Chechnya, Ingushetia, and Dagestan. I call on the authorities to conduct prompt and impartial investigations and to ensure the perpetrators are held to account. I also urge the authorities to fully uphold the right to political participation in the context of this month's presidential vote, to conduct policing of public gatherings in line with international standards, and to ensure freedoms of peaceful assembly, association, and expression. Mr. President, the human rights situation in Venezuela is deeply alarming. Malnutrition has increased dramatically throughout the country, affecting in particular children and the elderly. And credible reports indicate that government assistance programs are often conditioned on political considerations. I'm also deeply alarmed by the possibility that crimes against humanity have been committed and by the erosion of democratic institutions. The fundamental principle of separation of powers has been severely compromised. My office has also received credible reports of hundreds of extrajudicial killings in recent years, both during protests and security operations. I am seriously concerned that this context does not in any way fulfill minimal conditions for free and credible elections. I am deeply disturbed by the growing exodus of Venezuelans from their country, many of them in search of access to food and basic services. Once again, I encourage the Council to consider mandating a commission of inquiry to investigate human rights violations in Venezuela. In Honduras, I am alarmed at the surge in threats and intimidation against human rights defenders, journalists, media workers, and social and political activists. My office will release a report in the coming days detailing excessive use of force and mass arrests in response to protests which took place following the 2017 November elections, and the Council will be briefed on the 21st of March. In the United States, I'm shocked by reports that migrants intercepted at the southern borders, including children, are detained in abusive conditions, such as freezing temperatures, and that some young children are being detained separately from their families. Detentions and deportations of long-standing and law-abiding migrants have sharply increased, tearing families apart and creating enormous hardship. I deplore the continuing uncertainty about beneficiaries of the DACA program. I'm also concerned about the US decision to revoke the planned closure of the detention center at Guantanamo Bay. Indefinite incarceration in this facility without trial and in frequently inhumane conditions constitutes a breach of international law. I'm also concerned about proposals that could drastically reduce social protections, particularly in the light of the concerns expressed by the Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights following his visit to the US in December. In my meetings with the authorities in Uruguay, I commended their very significant efforts to integrate human rights into public policies. I trust we will see progress regarding violence against women and the very difficult conditions for adolescents in detention. In El Salvador, I am alarmed by consistent reports of extrajudicial killings by the security forces, fueled by very weak accountability for these crimes. Moves to disband or restructure police units which have been accused of extrajudicial killings do not replace the need to hold perpetrators to account. The situation of women and girls in the country continues to be deeply troubling, with rates of murder and violence against women among the highest in the region and frequently committed with impunity. Mr. President, during my mission to El Salvador in November, I was shaken by the draconian impact of the country's absolute prohibition of abortion. As of October last year, at least 159 women have been imprisoned since 1998 under this legislation. More than 20 of them for aggravated homicide and sentenced to between 30 and 40 years in jail. Many say they in fact suffered miscarriages or other obstetric emergencies. And all of those currently detained happen to be poor. Time and again, it is always the poor everywhere who, having no access to strong legal counsel, no family connections, no money with which to travel outside the country, suffer terribly. Always the poor. One young woman whom I met in detention was recently released following the commutation of her 30-year jail sentence. However, she has not been declared innocent and has received no reparations for the more than 10 years that she has spent in jail. And when many in the country want to raise the penalty beyond 30 years to 50 years, it brought home to me how cruel we humans can be and the unchallengeable need for human rights. I don't mind telling council members, all of us who heard the testimony of the young women at the Ilopango detention center wept openly with them. El Salvador should halt further application of this poorly conceived legislation and immediately review all cases where women have been detained for abortion-related offenses. It takes real courage to stand up for women's rights, including sexual and reproductive rights in many parts of the world in this 21st century. In countries across every region, women are suffering from increasingly regressive legislation, threats against activists, and a renewed obsession with controlling their decisions. In the past year, a new movement for justice has risen up to combat the abuse and sexual exploitation of women, the Me Too movement, an expression of solidarity and a force for dignity that is much needed, including in the wealthiest societies. Wherever I have traveled, I have been privileged to meet women who defy restrictions on their freedom. These resilient and powerful women have indeed taught me that every individual can help to reshape society and the world. I don't much like the phrase speaking truth to power, because in reality it is not rank which confers moral value. The power is in truth itself. I commend the many civil society movements fighting for decency and respect for human rights, including the rights of indigenous people facing unprincipled and lawless business activities, for LGBTI people whose governments do not ensure their equal rights or protect them adequately from violent assault, and the rights of Afro-descendants, Roma, and other ethnic, religious, or caste-based communities which frequently endure discrimination. In this 70th year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they are standing up for the fundamental principles which will bring a better future to all our children. I am deeply grateful for the surge of hope they bring. I thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. High Commissioner, I thank you very much for your statement. We'll now take a very short break before proceeding with the next interactive dialogue.